Muy buenos días y buenas tardes con todas las personas asistentes a estas charlas de la XConf. Ahora quisiera introducir rápidamente a la charla magistral del día de hoy, que es Redefinir la confianza, sesgos cognitivos en la vida del desarrollo. En esta ocasión, Birgitta Böckeler nos va a estar ayudando. Birgitta es directora de tecnologías de ThoughtWorks Alemania y cuenta con más de 15 años de experiencia como desarrolladora de profesión. Su pasión se centra en hacer malabares con las complejidades de la creación de software y encontrar la simplicidad en ello. Uno de sus objetivos principales es trabajar con un equipo de personas apasionadas y con ideas afines para crear un impacto extraordinario en el mundo. Dentro de ThoughtWorks pasa la mayor parte de su tiempo en los equipos de entrega de software, codificación, arquitectura, coaching y consultoría. Sobre su charla, les podemos contar que mientras hablamos, el Codex de sesgos cognitivos de Wikipedia tiene más de 200 entradas y el libro Pensar, rápido y despacio de Daniel Kahnemann se ha convertido en material de lectura habitual. Es oficial, no somos los pensadores racionales que nos gusta creer que somos. Esta charla repasa algunos de los sesgos cognitivos que nos hacen tropezar todo el tiempo en el desarrollo de software. Afectan la forma en que tomamos decisiones tecnológicas o de diseño y la forma también en que estimamos. Pueden influir en la forma en que controlamos y probamos nuestro software también y en la forma que enseñamos y aprendemos. Aunque no siempre son malos, nuestros delirios nos mantienen cuerdos, suelen decir. Queremos ser conscientes de ellos y mitigar su impacto, al menos en las decisiones críticas. Antes de iniciar con esta charla, solo recuerden que pueden activar la traducción en vivo en su barra de Zoom. También pensando para la accesibilidad del evento, podrán elegir si desean o no tener subtitulación en vivo al español durante estos 2 días. La opción se encuentra en la parte inferior de su barra de Zoom con el logo CC. Y también el canal de Slack está habilitado para hacer preguntas. El canal habilitado para hacer preguntas en esta charla es sesgos raya cognitivos. Sin más que agregar, empecemos. Thanks a lot, Birgitta, for joining us today. You can continue.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Abraham. I only understand very little Spanish, but I could recognize you introducing me as like a fellow thought worker from Germany, right? And I live in Berlin, but I'm actually dialing in from Munich right now, from the south of Germany. And thanks a lot for inviting me to XConf Latin America. Just do a final check. Yeah, you can all see my screen and everything. Cool. Then I will get started. So I want to start with a kind of question to you all. So who of you has ever gotten a piece of feedback where your initial reaction was kind of defensive, you know, where you kind of feel like, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying, but, you know, kind of like a defensive reaction. I think we all have that, right? And we all work on figuring out what is our defensive reaction, where should we listen and explore more what that feedback is that the person is giving us, right? And there's one category of feedback that always makes me react like that, kind of defensive. And this talk is actually about one of the reasons why I'm defensive about it, and also me justifying it a little bit. And here's an example of that type of feedback that I've actually gotten in the past. Birgitta, you do have in-depth technical knowledge, but you often use words that make your statements sound weaker. Or here's another piece of feedback that I've actually received in the past. You could be even more confident. And when I hear this type of feedback, so why am I so unreceptive to this? I think one of the reasons is that over the past few years, I've become really interested in learning more about cognitive biases and reading about them. And that has given me lots of questions about how rational I actually am. And in that context also about confidence and when one should be confident and when maybe one should not be so confident. And I want to talk to you about cognitive biases today, what they are, why I think it's important for us to know about them as software development practitioners. I will give some examples from the software delivery world, and I will finally reflect again on what that does to my confidence and come back to this feedback. So what we usually assume as humans is that we are generally rational, and in the cases where we're not, emotions can explain it. In the few cases where we're not rational, it's all about emotions. So that's kind of like something that is, I think, our base assumption. But in the 1970s, those assumptions were, for the first time, I think, challenged in a big way by somebody called Daniel Kahnemann and his collaborators and other people at the time. And they were establishing the idea that there might be things at play just in the way our brain works that quite naturally lead to errors in judgment and that affect our decision making. And that is quite normal, and that maybe we're not as rational as we think we are. And this started more than 50 years of research since then into these errors of judgment that we make as humans all the time. And it led to the study of behavioral economics and a Nobel Prize in economics, actually, for Daniel Kahnemann. And it led to this very popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It's been quoted a lot over the past few years. Like almost every conference I go to, there's at least one talk where somebody references this book. And here's a visual overview of all the cognitive biases. This is from Wikipedia, and you don't have to be able to read this. I just wanted to give you an idea of like how many of these errors of judgment have actually been documented. And a lot of them have actually also been scientifically confirmed. So there's a bit of, always when you research these, maybe look a little bit into like how researched each of them actually are, because a lot of them have popped up. There's also sometimes different names for the same one. And so all of these describe those behavioral patterns that show that we are not the rational thinkers that maybe we like to believe we are. And so I want to give you one first example of a cognitive bias, one that I think is relatively well known. It's called the confirmation bias. So it's our tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that it confirms our existing beliefs. So we tend to listen more, or sometimes only, to information that actually confirms what we already believe, that confirms our preconceptions. And these things can be really in our way when we're trying to be rational, successful software developers and architects who drive good decisions for the future. So it's almost like little bugs in our brain, right? So if we're looking for an example from the software world of confirmation bias, I think that with confirmation bias, paradigm shifts become harder, right? So like shifts in how we think about things in a very fundamental way. For example, a lot of us will have grown up in the profession with a very strong belief or advice that we should never repeat ourselves in code or in architecture, right? Don't repeat yourself, dry principle. But there has actually been a shift over time, also with microservices and distributed architectures and more decentralized teams, that it's also sometimes okay to copy, or even good to copy things, to avoid the pain of coupling, right? And to make a different trade-off there. And I think one of the reasons why it can be hard to make a shift like that from something that you really strongly believe to something else is that with confirmation bias, it's a lot easier for us to remember all of the occurrences where when we copied something, it actually had a bad outcome. Because it just confirms, our previous belief. So we always have to be careful if we're really remembering everything in a rational way. So this is just one small example of how a bias can affect us in software development when it comes to these shifts in how we are doing things. So why should we even care about this? Do these biases really have such a big impact? The thing is that software development is actually full of uncertainty, right? Like, for example, distributed architectures, things can fail all the time, lots of uncertainty there. There are usually third-party dependencies that behave different from what we thought they would behave like. We have customers and users who behave and think differently from what we thought. Just like the term custom software development already says something about how every time we put together a new unique combination of things, right? So lots of change and uncertainty, and things just turn out different in real life than on paper. And unfortunately, our brains do not like uncertainty. So in this article in the Guardian, the author actually writes that uncertainty is even more stressful for us than knowing something bad is definitely going to happen. So when we know something bad is definitely going to happen, that's less stressful than when we don't know what's going to happen. And there are quite a few cognitive biases that can be explained by our challenge to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty, and by the stress that we have with uncertainty. For example, in how it affects that we can be quite bad at evaluating and reducing risk. So the zero risk bias is our preference for reducing a small risk to zero over a greater reduction in overall risk. So that we kind of like sometimes really try to look at this one risk and really, really try to reduce it to zero, but we don't look at the big picture and the risk that we have overall. And maybe it's okay to have a little bit of risk in all of our separate areas, because that overall reduces our risk, right? But looking at this one thing that we can control, I think gives us like a good feeling of control, right? Where over that one risk. And I think this zero risk bias kicks in every time we spend a lot of effort on preparing for a risk and not taking into account the probability of that risk manifesting. In software development, that happens when we put a lot of effort on securing that one little piece of an application, but not looking at the bigger picture of overall risk of our security profile. Or when we spend a lot of effort on avoiding lock-in to a cloud provider, like basically reducing it to zero, but not again looking at the big picture of risk that we have by putting all that effort in. Or premature optimization. So when we put a lot of effort on optimizing for scalability in the very beginning without even looking at user projections, or when we put a lot of effort on abstracting things away early on, just in case we want to change that database later or that cloud provider. And so it makes us maybe feel good that we're controlling this one thing, but we might actually be endangering the overall delivery and business success, right? And our preference for what to spend time on and which risks we want to reduce is also affected by yet more biases. So the availability heuristic is our tendency to think that if something can be easily remembered, it must be important. So the things that easily come to our mind, that we easily remember, they seem more important to us, and they affect our decisions more, therefore. So unfortunately, in the context of evaluating risk, often stories that of when things went horribly wrong, they stick very well in our minds, right? And then because we remember them more easily than maybe the positive stories, that then affects our risk assessment. And we then disproportionately consider past experience that was more extreme, rather than looking at the actual cases and the more, let's say, normal things that happened, because they're harder for us to remember. Yeah, so, but I, of course, don't only want to talk about like all the errors that our brains might be making, right? But like, what are things that we can do about it, right? By the way, all of these things, actually, they're there for a reason. They also help us keep sane, right? So they're all there for a reason. It's not like that we're buggy. They're also features, not just bugs. So what can we do about them, though? One thing we can do is use models, right, to help us structure our thinking and not fall into some of these traps. For example, in the case of security, we can use threat modeling, which is a framework to think about the assets that we have in our application or in our system landscape, the risks that those assets might be compromised, and the probability that that might happen, and the impact. So it's like a nice risk assessment framework where we can look at all the different scenarios and then decide which risks are worth looking at and which are not. Or in case of avoiding vendor lock-in, like cloud provider lock-in, for example, I can really recommend this article by Gregor Hope, Don't Get Locked Up in Avoiding Lock-in, where he also talks about models. So I don't know if this is too small or if all of you can see this. So there's this little magic quadrant here about looking at the utility versus the switching cost of something that you buy from a vendor, and then looking at things that way and helping your brain a little bit evaluate better what you're getting into and what the trade-offs are. And trade-off is also the big keyword, right? Like almost everything in software development, and certainly in architecture, is all about trade-offs, right? We'll always have good and bad sides to a decision, and we have to see what trade-off we need to make. So, for example, the trade-off between spending a lot of money on securing all the things versus consciously leaving a few things more vulnerable because it wouldn't have as much impact if it gets compromised. Or the trade-off between spending lots of money on avoiding lock-in 100% versus strategically using some vendor-specific things and accepting a little bit of lock-in to get ahead today and to move faster. And finally, the Agile Manifesto is kind of full of principles to help us deal with uncertainty, because Agile is all about embracing change, right? For example, this principle of responding to change over following a plan, so really preparing for change all the time because it's inevitable. So therefore, we want to embrace it and be prepared for it. Another way that biases stand in our way is that they can make us waste our time. I mean, I've already talked a little bit about that, like premature optimization, things like that. So, but another example would be probably all the developers in the audience have experienced this, like running in circles when you're trying to find the cause for a bug, right? And availability heuristic can really come in here. Again, I think that's definitely happened to me in the past with debugging and finding a bug, right? So to repeat that, so this was about when we can remember something more easily, that we also think it's more important or more relevant. So for example, I once watched a developer try to find the cause for a bug, and they were chasing this theory that it had something to do with encoding. It was like a front end bug, but there wasn't actually much evidence that the bug had something to do with encoding. But that developer had just transferred over from another team where they had recently chased a bug for days, and that had turned out to be caused by encoding problems. So it was very fresh on their mind. As developers, we really love sharing stories of that one really freaky bug we encountered with that really weird solution, right? Or that really weird cause. And those stories really stuck in our heads more than those of the really mundane ones, like Tomcat ran out of memory because the default settings are never enough. So that happens all the time, right? And it's more often the cause of a bug than something else, if you're using Tomcat, which is maybe a bit of an outdated example. Another thing that can get us to spend our time on something that's not worth spending our time on is that we really suck at statistics. So here's a live example that I took from a book that I read, The Art of Thinking Clearly. So look at the statement. Mark is a thin man from Germany with glasses who likes to listen to Mozart. So which of these two things is more likely, you think? That Mark is a truck driver, or that Mark is a professor of literature in Frankfurt? And the case is actually that it's actually more probable that Mark is a truck driver, because there are a lot more German men who are truck drivers than there are German men who are professors of literature. But because we have these stereotypes in our head about men who wear glasses and like to listen to Mozart, we think that Mark being a professor of literature is more probable, or that's at least what my brain jumped to. I don't know if that happened to you as well. And that's what I like about the book as well, by the way, that I mentioned in the beginning, Thinking Fast and Slow. They give these little examples in there, or these little exercises almost, that help you observe these cognitive biases on yourself. So it makes it easier to understand them. So in this example of Mark the truck driver and what is more probable, so base rate fallacy is describes our tendency to ignore the kind of like prior probabilities in favor of specific information. So it's like a fancy definition, right? So kind of like we don't actually think about the actual probabilities of like how many truck drivers are there, how many professors of literature are there, but we look at the specific information we have and we immediately jump to a conclusion. And this, I think, also becomes relevant when we think about edge cases, for example, when we spend time on that problem that one customer has, and we know a lot about this specific problem because they keep calling and the customer service keeps bugging us about this particular problem. And there is a danger that we then think this is a common problem that everybody has without checking further how common this actually is, or if it's really like this one edge case. So next time you think your bug was caused by a freaky race condition, for example, it's much more likely that it was caused by, you coding something wrong, actually. And there's this nice quote from Maurice Wilkes, who was a British computer scientist, who said, "It was with some shock and dismay that I realized that a good part of the remainder of my life was going to be spent on finding errors in my own programs." So, so again, we often think of all of these different things that something that a bug could be caused by, but often it's it's kind of like something that we did, and it's actually much more mundane. So another thing you can do about this, like let's take the example of debugging, is to kind of like, I'm calling it here, channel your inner scientist, right? So the scientific method, set up a hypothesis, like what do I think this bug is caused by, for example, encoding, then design an experiment to find out how you could find out if it's actually caused by encoding, and then analyze what you get out of the experiment, right? So I sometimes like to just like write sticky notes on my desk and kind of write up my hypotheses and then think about what I want to try, because that also gives me a history of what I've already tried and what I haven't tried. So I really have data. And of course, experience and gut feeling still comes in here, right? Like the longer you've worked as a software developer, the more experience and gut you have. And that's also going to lead you in a good direction about which hypotheses maybe you want to try first. But, getting a bit more structure into it and prioritizing the hypotheses and what you want to actually experiment with can really help us structure us more and not step into these bias traps. Pairing is another way to help you with this. So what I really appreciate about pairing is that I have to justify why I'm trying something out. I often get into rabbit holes, kind of saying, this might be like an interesting thing to try. And I try that and suddenly 2 hours have gone by. And I used to pair with this colleague, a fellow software developer who was really good at that, like as not letting me go down rabbit holes. He would say, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? It was almost starting to annoy me, but it was really good for our discipline and it was really making us very productive. And 2 brains are less biased than 1 brain. So it's easier to avoid those traps. And then finally, another way to help with that is rubber ducking. I don't know if you all know that term. So it's kind of this idea that you're imagining to talk to a rubber duck, right? So what I sometimes do is I pretend to, or not pretend, but I start writing a message to somebody to ask for help. And so I have to write down to them, like, this is the bug, this is what I've already tried. And then while I'm writing it, I'm trying to imagine all the questions that they would ask. And often just by writing that message, I get a new idea of what I could do. So there's like an imaginary person that I start writing this to, the rubber duck, and that gave me a new idea. So those were a few examples about how I think we're struggling to deal with the uncertain world of software development. Questions also, like, where do we really have to be that careful and do that all the time? Do the, hypotheses, the pairing, all of those things, right? Is that really important all of the time? Or how do we prioritize where we take more care and less care? It's a quote from Martin Fowler here: architecture is the important stuff that people perceive as hard to change. So especially when we have these situations where we feel like, okay, we're working on something that will be hard to change later, that is an example of a situation where you really want to be more aware of these little fallacies where you might be influenced by things in your brain that are not rational. The last area I want to give examples of is that of decision-making. In particular, decision-making when it comes to architecture or to maybe things that have a high impact and are harder to change later, where you want to take more care. Because if we constantly assume that we are being totally rational, then that can actually prevent us from learning from our decisions to better decisions in the future. And my biggest eye-opener in the past few years in this area was when I learned about outcome bias. Outcome bias is our tendency to evaluate the quality of a decision based on the outcome of that decision. So basically, we're saying that, we took a decision, the outcome of the decision was bad. So we conclude from that the decision was bad as well. To give an example, maybe from a team in my past, this was already years ago when React, the front-end framework, was still relatively new. And at the time, we were looking into how to do state management with that. And today, or at least like a year or two ago, one of the default ways to do that was a framework called Redux. At the time, Redux was not the default framework for that yet. So we actually used something called Reflux. And later it turned out that we actually moved back to Redux because Reflux wasn't really maintained anymore. Redux had turned out to be the more of the default, so we had to make that move. So you could say that the outcome of that decision was bad because we had the extra effort later to move to another framework. But at the time when we took the decision, was it really a bad decision? Or with the information at the time and how we actually evaluated this, maybe it was a good decision after all. We were just unlucky because there was like another factor happening in the open source world that we couldn't have predicted with the information we had. Or the other way around, whenever we use tech, let's say just because we heard about it at a conference or our sister-in-law's cousin works at Netflix and that tech works for them, so we say we use it and it actually works well for us, right? So good outcome, this worked well for us. But was it also a good decision to base this on like some hearsay from some other person, but maybe we didn't even take any care looking if it actually fits our solution and it was just luck. Outcome bias is a big topic in this book, Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, that I can really recommend. I really, really enjoyed reading this book. And in there, she actually calls it resulting. And that is a term that is used. So Annie Duke was a really successful professional poker player. And in poker, they actually use this word resulting for outcome bias, so that when you actually won a hand, you think, that was a good outcome. So you think all of the decisions you took about your betting before that must also have been good. And Annie Duke says that it's super hard for us to see the difference between a good decision disconnected from a good outcome. So she also talks a bit about how we can get better at this. So, and she's talking there about getting more awareness of what was skill and what was luck. So really trying to analyze a bit and distinguish that, right? Was it just bad luck that Redux didn't turn out to be the default framework, or could we have known it at the time? And I think we're already doing that a bit implicitly when we use the retrospective prime directive. So in there, it talks about given what we knew at the time, our skills and abilities at the time, the resources available and the situation at hand, right? So when we're retrospecting, we're already looking at what did we know at the time, right? And then we think about what could we have done better. And I think that's like an implicit way of doing this, distinguishing between the skill from luck. So, and again, there are actually other biases, even more biases, that make it harder for us to distinguish luck from skill. And one of those is the self-serving bias. So that is when we ascribe success to our own abilities and efforts, but whenever we fail, we blame it on external factors. So when there's a good outcome of a decision, we say, that was our skill. That's because we're such a good team, because I'm such a good architect, right? But when there's a bad outcome of a decision, then we're more likely to see, it was just bad luck. We couldn't have known that, this company would stop maintaining this framework. So Annie Duke in her book also has some other tips about getting better at distinguishing luck and skill despite things like self-serving bias. And she says that we have to basically redefine what being right means. And also, change our notion of what being right means. So she's saying that there's too much like black and white, or maybe better terms like all or nothing thinking, right? So we're thinking that decisions are either wrong or they're right. But they're not either wrong or right. They're better or worse, right? So in some decisions, our skill has more impact than others. It has less, right? And outcomes of decisions are always some mix of luck and skill. So we can start changing our mindset with language, for example. I've started saying appropriate coupling a lot, for example, instead of saying low coupling or high coupling, because in different situations, you might need a different level of coupling actually. Or I'm trying to avoid saying best practice, because it sounds as if there's like one right thing to do things, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. It depends on the situation, right? So I'm trying to say good practice, and I'm asking, is it appropriate for us in this situation? So since I've read that book, I've never thought about the words right and wrong again in quite the same way, and using them much more carefully. So again, it's all about trade-offs, right? Pros and cons, good sides and bad sides of a decision, and reminding ourselves how it's all just a big gray zone. And another thing that helps yourself and your future self be aware of those trade-offs is also to write decision records in a way that they really document the implications of your decisions and what you knew at the time and the situation at hand. So you can later also go back and see, was this actually a good decision or a bad decision, regardless of the outcome. And it also gives you compassion for yourself. If you blame yourself for a bad decision outcome in the future, you can go back to look at how you took that decision and learn from it, and also explain the bad luck. So I just talked about 6 cognitive biases out of more than the 200 documented. So confirmation bias was that we remember and notice things more that confirm our current beliefs. Zero risk bias means we focus too much on smaller risk but neglect the overall big picture. Availability heuristic, we think that things we remember easily are more important or even more true. Base rate fallacy was an example of how we suck at statistics. Outcome bias is about not learning properly from our decisions because we equate outcome of the decision with the decision quality. And self-serving bias is all about we don't learn properly from our decisions because we might not properly distinguish skill from luck to serve our own self-image. And here are just some of the resources where I learned about cognitive biases. I mentioned Thinking Fast and Slow, Thinking in Bets, The Art of Thinking Clearly. All of these have thinking in the title. I've never noticed that until just now, actually. And I also like to listen to this podcast, You Are Not So Smart. So let's come back to the beginning and wrap it up. So I told you about this feedback that I received. You could be even more confident. But for me today, I'm really wondering, what does that even mean, being confident? I think confidence is really situational. It depends, right? Underconfidence can be bad, yes, when it blocks us from acting or makes us focus disproportionately on something that is not important. But overconfidence can also be quite counterproductive because it might make us complacent, right? It might make us think, oh yeah, I know how this works, but then we fall into more of those bias traps and we don't go out to collect more information about what reality actually looks like. So I also then ask myself, do I really want to be more confident in the conventional sense of the word? Will that actually make me more successful, or will it lead to the opposite? Because I believe that my confidence also manifests with things like saying, I'm not sure, asking questions, or changing my mind. And in the 2 cultures that have been dominant in my professional career, the German culture and the US American culture, at least like these things are not necessarily seen as signs of an, let's say, appropriate confidence level, or like a confidence level that makes you a successful person, right? And I believe that these things are undervalued, which is a pity, because doing these things more than is maybe commonly done in these work cultures has actually worked quite well for me, I think. And which is why my confirmation bias fully kicked in when I read any news advice that we should use uncertainty to our advantage, which we're doing when we're saying, I'm not sure, and asking questions, because we're collecting more information and then we can take better decisions. So she's saying that doubt helps us to learn and be creative, and that acknowledging uncertainty is the first step in getting closer to what is objectively true. But of course, I'm not just like bravely going ahead and asking more questions. There are also things that I rely on that make me feel good about that, like a safety net. And some of those examples are, I already mentioned, some of the principles in Agile, doing things iteratively and all the things that we're doing to embrace uncertainty and changing a plan when it doesn't work out, going step by step. And then getting started is also always a good principle for me, like not being getting into analysis paralysis, but whenever we get started, we get more information. So, and more information helps us with those biases. Sharing and listening. So not thinking that I have all the solutions, but like I said before, when I talked about pairing, two brains are less probable to fall into bias traps than just one brain, right? Like letting others talk first and really listening to input. And I already talked about documenting decisions as well to learn about them. And of course, in general, just raising awareness and learning a bit about these biases and trying to realize when they happen to myself has also helped. So in turn, when I do all of those things, I get more learning and collaboration out of it, and ultimately, I believe, better software. And I want to end with a final thought, kind of going back to changing the baseline of what is considered as an appropriate confidence level to be successful. So you need to be more confident is actually feedback that is given to women a lot more than to men, or maybe also in general to underrepresented groups more to white men. And it's one of those things where there is an existing baseline of how a successful professional is supposed to behave, but that baseline was shaped by the white men who have been the majority in the industry for a really long time. And then this baseline has been applied or is still applied to everybody else who comes in, and everybody's being told, oh, you need to be more like this to be successful. But maybe sometimes that baseline needs to be changed in the first place, right? What if our confidence, like my confidence, for example, is just fine, but the average is too confident? Because there is literally a bias called the overconfidence effect, and biases are errors in judgment. So I want to leave you with that thought, thinking about how confident are you about your confidence level in different situations. And, I would kind of ask you to reflect on that, saying, I'm not sure more, asking questions. And I think that makes us better learners, makes us more inclusive, more compassionate to others and to ourselves, more collaborative and more creative, ultimately.